Over the weekend, Charlie Kirk's alleged murderer was caught, his motives are indecipherable, and he is not cooperating with authorities. I assume you've already seen my first video on Charlie Kirk's death, but I'd like to reiterate that what happened on that regular day in any town USA was appalling, even for America's standards. Every nation has had its moments of self-inflicted shame, that's undeniable. But what other developed nation routinely flirts with staying there? What other developed nation insists on degrading their democracy to that of a third world banana republic where assassinations are seen as just another campaign tool? As an outsider, I can assure you that the rest of the civilized world has always looked on in morbid curiosity at the United States, who seem to not only tolerate but expect a certain level of political violence in its democratic process, as if this was almost an experimental element of free speech. But the fact that the commentary, almost as quickly as the bullet had exited Charlie's neck, immediately shifted to questioning whether or not Charlie Kirk deserved to die, or further, if violence is now justified, I think, anyway, if you will pardon the phrase, is a turning point. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, leaders from across the aisle and newspapers, regardless of their affiliations and leanings, condemned the act and somberly called for national unity. Not that this was needed, as the citizenry itself, bar the far-off minuscule fringes, were already in mourning. There wasn't an air of partisanship about it because they were civically minded enough to know that they weren't just mourning a national tragedy, they were mourning an attack on the presidency itself, an attack on an institution vital for the democratic process to function. No one had to tell them this. They knew it. They understood that Kennedy's assassination was bigger than politics. It was civics. That this wasn't just an attack on the player, but an attack on the game itself. How quaint that all seems now. As if civic decency is a historical heirloom like a town crier bell or tri-corner hat. For in today's America, before the gunman was even caught, before we even knew his name, let alone his political leanings, you had leading Republicans and media figures quick to blame the Democrats and calling for reprisals. Due to the inundation of American politics that the world consumes with relish, I think I have a taste for what the average American feels when there's yet another school shooting. You're not shocked that it happened. You're shocked that you're no longer shocked. Charlie Kirk would have had to have been one of the Republican Party's most effective political warriors. Unlike most commentators who take the coward's position of, oh, I think they're all the same, Charlie proudly wore the title of Republican as a badge of honour. He was a true believer in the cause, and yet as his body lay limp, they used his carcass as a rag doll to chuck into the grinding mill of endless point-scoring processed into the news cycle, as if it was a perfectly normal response from a mainstream parliamentary party in a Western democracy that could gain government, let alone is in government, to turn it into a partisan point as unthinkingly as a reflex. Australia's current ambassador to the US is a former Prime Minister of ours. He would have to have the exact opposite opinion to Charlie Kirk on virtually any issue. When he was shot, his response was, "The death of Charlie Kirk today is deeply distressing. There is no space for political violence in any democracy. My thoughts, and those of all Australians, are with his family and loved ones." Compare that response to Trump's, who was supposedly one of Charlie's best friends. I can assure the Americans watching that the response from Republican leadership in Australia would have been reserved only for the fringe. Here you would have heard it from barely elected swill and the rightfully reduced crossbench like Ralph Babbitt. That's the same level a mainstream party is on now. Crossbench swill, confoundingly with a majority in both houses. I'm not going to pretend, though it would be personally convenient to do so for maximum online engagement, that Democrats return served. I'm more than happy to note, because it's important, that Democratic leadership was consistent and uniform in their condemnation. If only the leadership had anyone left to lead. The usual Democrat-leaning commentators that are of note in both the old and new media follow what is the unequivocal sane response template. They express sympathy for Charlie's family, condemned the act, said there's no room for violence in a democracy. But to who? Granted, their videos performed well, but all of a sudden, the feed was filled with a flurry of new commentators that were previously non-entities competing in viewership with the stalwarts because the base was not buying what the sane was selling. They wanted people who reflected their view that I honestly thought would have been relegated to fringe forums, but apparently it's mainstream opinion now. They wanted someone to justify the schadenfreude they felt over Charlie Kirk's death. I'm not including memeing on Charlie Kirk's death in this. Dark humour is employed by some of the best people in society. Paramedics and nurses that are confronted with horrific deaths on a daily basis use dark humour as a coping mechanism because, by its nature, it is a tacit admission that the event itself was twisted. I'm talking about the sea of chronically online freaks who sincerely think that Charlie Kirk's death is deserved. Always with the same pattern that these hypocrites have smugly derided for years in Republicans. I'm not a racist, but. Their version is confoundingly more unsettling. It's I don't condone violence, but. The but is followed always by 8 paragraphs explaining why they think that it's not only justified, why they think they're morally superior for justifying it, always with the fig leaf camouflage splayed over the top, which is, I said I don't condone violence, therefore you can't accuse me of condoning violence. You will see what I'm talking about in these very comments. Long, elaborate paragraphs, always followed by the template of, he said X, he was insert X label. Very often they try and make themselves out to be the victim of his hateful tirades, because Charlie getting sniped in the neck is obviously about them, of course. Some of them are so noble, in fact, that they don't even have these opinions for themselves. They have it on behalf of X aggrieved minority that Charlie killed with his Instagram reels. They might have even chucked in insert X country has political killings all the time, and yet you never talk about that. In fact, even caring about this is the Chronically Online's favourite dismissal, some sort of right-wing grift. Awful lot of words to say I condone political violence. On that last point, the reason Charlie's death is significant and not in country X is that the United States is not country X. It is supposedly the leader of the free world, and it plunging to the democratic doldrums of a Colombia or Pakistan, where killing is as acceptable in the so-called democratic process as voting. That's globally significant. Rightly or wrongly, from the endless brainwashing of Friends repeats, the rest of the world looks to the United States for cues of normality. Speaking of Pakistan, you will notice that political and religious assassinations there are like the democracy sausage in Australia. It's part of the process. You'll notice that every single time a mufti's killed, it follows a very similar line of reasoning to those justifying Charlie's death. This mufti said X. He was insert X label. If anything, my sect of Islam is the real victim. So be sure, Americans, Charlie Kirk's death is not the end of democracy. But it's that kind of democracy that you're heading for. Naturally, like with everything else, these people will fall back on blaming their favourite nebulous flavour of the system. Some will blame the gun lobby, economic inequality, the radical left, which appears to be a cheap rebrand of the 50s retro charm that is communism. Again, it's deeply concerning but not surprising that many suspect that it's a false flag operation staged by the government, yet time and again you have the killer come from comfortable economic circumstances, while commentary on the so-called politics, if we can even call this event political, is widely consumed by the middle class or higher. The problem is not the man. The problem is the everyday man. This is something that is deeply sick within the citizenry of the United States. And like all mental patients, of course they want to externalize the blame into some invisible enemy that only they can see. Many will claim that the man was quite literally the man, rationalizing their Schadenfreude by saying that this is the society that Charlie Kirk wanted. So did you. Only 67% of millennials and just 44% of Gen Z, that is less than half of Gen Z, think that violence is never acceptable against an elected official. What's the common denominator within these two demographics? They're the ones that are the most online. In fact, you have a third of American students, not exactly an economically disadvantaged cohort. University is a thoroughly middle-class endeavour, and yet you have a third of that widely comfortable cohort believing that violence is an acceptable response to speech. They're not all watching Charlie. There will be all sorts of barely coherent, non-Charlie related ideological justifications across the quote-unquote political spectrum justifying violence, and I can assure you, very little, if any of them, held the exact same poisonous combination of talking points as Tyler Robertson, because they've got their own Reddit forum for that. They've got their own personal curation of ex-commentators that gaslight their rapid descent into Pakistani-style extremism. The point is that a third of them think that Tyler had a point. The only point uniting them is that up to a third of Gen Z can all agree that Tyler was acting within the acceptable democratic bounds. Children are our future, and that's what we're witnessing. The sprouts of that line of thinking. Everything about this was internet-aged brain rot. This was an internet celebrity making content for a chronically online audience, killed by a chronically online man, with memes engraved into his bullets that are so indecipherable to authorities that they still don't understand what his political ideology was, and that's because I can assure you, neither does he. His ideology is what political scientists will one day refer to as slop, soup-brained. It is nothing more but the result of American culture colliding with 21st century brain rot. As is now becoming a cliche, the global experiment of social media is not even 2 decades old, and it's already proving to be the human equivalent of when you put a dolphin in a tank in SeaWorld and its own echoes bounce off the wall and slowly drive it insane. We have our own echo chambers that we voluntarily put ourselves in. You can blame anything you like on the demise of the US in recent decades. Every boogeyman is probably going to have some level of validity to it. But that mindset right there, Charlie had it coming. That's going to be the nail in the coffin. It won't have the effect that they think it'll have either. As has already happened, he's become far more influential than he ever was alive. He's been elevated from commentator to martyr. What did you think was going to happen? Is that mission accomplished, is it, Tyler? This is being seen as permission for more violence, which of course is going to be condoned and draw sympathy from, as potentially half of his generation thinks Tyler has a point. I know this is of no concession. In fact, it might even come off as gloating, and perhaps it is. But I was the target of a failed assassination attempt. What always made me feel like Australia is a good place is the fact that even my political enemies, and I can assure you I have many, they came out and publicly declared, even if it was for internet clout, that it was unacceptable. Regardless of how self-serving and click-hungry the performance was, the performance still had to be performed to an audience that believed that political violence cannot ever be justified. It cannot be rationalised. Yes, we have violent political outbursts every now and then. Every country does. But it will find no safe harbour here. It is a line in the sand that the general public will not cross. What's startling is, even many Australians who would have agreed with the basic premise of our democracy not condoning the violence, not condoned the violence, butted their way out of Charlie's murder, and that's because America, just so you know, you give off the cue to the rest of the world that this is how your democracy should function. These people clearly consume a lot of your media bile, and that's what your media bile has taught them. As you will expect, these chronically online freaks, due to their confounding solipsism, expected that I would make them feel okay for having the sick view that Charlie had it coming, and because I didn't, they freaked out, Q8 paragraphs justifying in their own minds why they're morally superior for thinking that Charlie deserved to die, but I said, I don't condone violence, so I'm right in both ways at once, unsubscribed. If only that were true. I know that they're basically a heroin addict for Twitter. They will be back because they enjoy finding reasons to have fits over, but believe me when I say, I sincerely wish they didn't come back. I don't want an audience filled with the likes of you. I don't want to pander to your mental derangements for views. There are many others who do, but I don't want to be subjected to an audience capture that is that easy to please, that monetizable due to the amount of content they consume online. I don't want to be held captive to those freaks. I would hope that I'm striving to appeal to the sane, those who actually believe what I thought were basic conventions like it's not okay to shoot someone for an opinion, and it's certainly not okay to shoot someone else as some sort of retort. For any American that is watching that belongs to this ever-shrinking voting bloc it appears to be these days, that is the sane, I'm sorry that this is happening to your country. I truly am. I think it must have been a gradual decline where all of a sudden you felt an air of oppression that you couldn't feel before, and that's because a nation's atmosphere is made up of its citizens. I'm sure that you've gradually grown fearful of what you can say around your friends, family, work colleagues, and neighbours, because that half of the country doesn't just sprout out of nowhere, and any one of them could be the next Tyler Robinson. I can't say that I would be surprised either if this is how the great American experiment ends, an attention-fractured kaleidoscope of echo chamber narcissism, but unlike Charlie Kirk, you don't have to prove me wrong. I hope I am. If I'm not, I'm sorry for your loss.